We'll see how it goes.
All right, I'm going to start with a question. Who here has ever started at a new job? Oh, okay, a lot of you, that's good. Well, this should work for you, whether you're doing developing, operations, acting, you should be able to get something from this. So it doesn't really matter how great you did in your interview or how much of an expert you are in your field or who you know who works at the company. When you first start off, it's pretty horrible. You don't know what's going on. You're going to be looking around at everybody else. They all know what's going on, and you're just going to be completely clueless. And it kind of sucks. But this is actually a good thing. Hiring new people is one of the great opportunities for a workplace, because the feeling of being lost and not knowing what's going on is something that you can use. When people show you how to do something, if you document it, you can help them when they hire new people in the future. So first, I'll just say a little bit about myself. I currently work as a technical support agent for Fastmail. It's a number of jobs that I've had working in technology, but I actually studied a Bachelor of Arts majoring in anthropology, and that's Betty White in Community, who is probably the most famous anthropologist I could think of. I have a fair amount of practice in trying to pick up information really quickly from more technical colleagues than me, and I have a lot of experience in being the person in the room who knows the least. And in most places I've worked, documentation has been pretty sparse. I worked in one place where all of the documentation was stored as uploads on a Facebook group. Don't do this. I've worked in other places where they don't have much documentation apart from comments in code, which is very useful for those of us who don't code. And even companies that I've worked in that do have strong documentation practices can over-rely on assumed knowledge, which also doesn't help people when they're just starting out. And then there's my personal favorite, which I'd like to show you. This is perfectly good documentation. It's stored in a subfolder of a subfolder in a shared folder as Microsoft Word documents, and they're labeled only by the dates they were created. It may not shock you to realize that this was all drastically out of date. So what I'll be talking about, I'm going to go over why you and your company should invest time in documentation in your very first weeks. I'll go over what you should choose to document and how you can document when you're first starting, and then the steps for after you're practiced, how to continue building on the work you've already put in. So why should I invest this time? Because you know the right questions to ask when you first arrive and everything is new. And so there's something that might seem easy and natural to an employee who's been doing the job for 2 years is going to seem alien and impossible to somebody who's just starting out. The person who's been there for a couple of years might not even realize that it's hard. In some companies, there's limited or no documentation. In others, they just assume that you already know. So when you do write down these questions and the answers to these questions, you can cut down the time spent training significantly. And that benefits both your company and it benefits new hires when they come in. I actually just recently had one of our brand new support staff start off searching logs, which is really, really hard. And she started that about a month after she started working. It took us several months to get to that point because we did implement this practice of documenting things. So documentation you write when you start, it'll go into a cumulative knowledge repository. It's something that you can use because nobody remembers things when they first start. I certainly forgot everything that I was taught immediately. When I started writing things down, I went back to them all the time. And most importantly, apart from training, internal documentation helps foster a personality diverse and inclusive team. It's a non-confrontational way for all team members to access information. There are team members who might be introverted or suffer from anxiety, and they can find it really difficult in certain teams to access knowledge. And that problem just gets significantly worse if there's any issues with clickiness among senior staff, or if staff members are just not willing to make the time to answer questions. And we've all heard the phrase, there are no stupid questions, but in practice that's not really how people act sometimes. But documentation is always a completely non-judgmental way for everybody to get up to speed. So what should you document when you first start out? You should document anything that you find hard about your job or about the company. If you find something difficult, there's a chance that there's a knowledge gap that you can use. You can remedy it and make life easier for somebody who's coming up. So when you start a new job, you should consider what kinds of people will get value for the documentation that you're writing. Most of what you're documenting will ideally be focused around your own work because you're the expert there. But you also need to keep in mind who will need to access the documentation apart from people in your own job description. So for instance, I do technical support right now. Anybody who's following me into my role will need a pretty broad scattergun approach. They don't need to know how to fix bugs. They do need to know how to find them and diagnose them, and who to approach when there is a bug discovered. So you can expect somebody like me to be quite technically competent, although maybe not as technically competent as a developer. And if you have somebody like me, who's a support person who needs to do anything highly technical, like Git or the occasional bit of coding, it needs to be spelled out step by step. I actually do Git in my job, and I have written about Git. So most of what you write will be aimed at somebody exactly like you, but anything that you're writing about that's outside your immediate job description might need to be accessed by somebody with less technical ability. And that includes things like how to book leave in your internal company system. That's something that everybody needs to know how to do, but they might not be able to do it if they're not very practiced with computers. So you might consider documenting log into the portal and make a leave request, which that might sound fine, but if your portal is quite complicated for somebody who does not have much experience beyond opening their email, then you might need to write some more concrete instructions. So you just got a new job and you're just starting out. What do you do then? Ideally, your company will already have a wiki or a SharePoint or some sort of quick, easy way to create and edit documentation. If you're lucky, you'll have access to both reading and editing it, and that's the perfect place to start. It's pretty rare to start a new job that doesn't have any sort of documentation practice, although it's a little more common that you might not have access to editing it. So if you don't have editing privileges when you begin, just do it anyway. Do it on your own computer, do it in a notepad, just do it somewhere and get it out there. And that's really important because if you just keep thinking, I'll do it later, you are going to end up forgetting the tiny points that actually make it work. It'd be wonderful if you could do it all perfectly the first time and have it be accurate and entertaining and get it out to the rest of the company. It's not particularly likely, but you can always fix it up later. And the ability to ask good questions and identify knowledge gaps, that's something you can't really recreate after you've been in the job for a couple of years. So since I work in support, one of the things I use for documentation is actually a lot of saved support tickets. And this is something I find surprisingly useful, more useful than you might expect, because support tickets can show you a window into how your customers are using your product. And they might find little idiosyncrasies that you weren't even aware of. So it's well worth a look through. They can serve as part of your cumulative knowledge repository. You can even write notes to yourself on Slack. I do this a fair bit. Sometimes I might learn something very useful, but I might not have time to figure out exactly how it works and document it in the wiki. So for instance, command line tools. At Fastmail, we use a lot of command line tools to search logs, and support staff need to do this quite a lot. Somebody asks, what happened to my message? We need to be able to find it. It can be sometimes difficult to understand the syntax because it's highly technical, So sometimes I have people, help me craft a search for something particularly difficult. And if I don't have time to figure out how it works then and there and document it, I'll write out the command in a Slack note to myself, and then later when I do have time, I'll run the command again and figure out how it works and then document it properly. So I think that the best thing about internal documentation is that it is internal, and that means you can do it really quickly. You can worry about things like spelling later. You can have a bit of fun, I think. It can be a great place to welcome people to the company. It's not customer facing. You don't need to worry about every little choice of words. So you can use writing as a way to welcome somebody new. I write an awful lot of tutorials, which I enjoy. I like to use metaphors and characters to explain more difficult concepts. And that makes it easier for me to write, and hopefully it makes it easier for somebody else to read. The first tutorial I wrote was on log searching, and I wrote a tutorial on how to tell from the logs what has happened to an email that came in from the point of view of Iron Man wondering why Captain America wasn't sending him any emails. And that's something you can play around with that you wouldn't be able to do for any kind of external thing, and that helps me get concepts clear in my mind. And the other kind of tutorial I prefer to write is an interactive one in which the person following the tutorial creates and resolves their own problem. So I've been talking a lot about searching mail logs being a huge part of my job, because it is. I've written a few tutorials that involve the reader sending themselves an email and then going through how to find that email in the logs. I find it's really helpful to get practical content, because that accounts for a huge breadth of learning styles. And I've also retaken my own tutorials quite a few times to get a better grasp of things, which just goes to show that, this is for you too. You're not going to remember everything the first time you learn it. So keep in mind that technical tips on how to do the core requirements of your job only cover one area. There's an awful lot of assumed social knowledge in a workplace, and I think it's really important to document that too, to make your workplace a more welcoming environment. So that includes things like if, when, and where these staff might hang out after work, if they have a favorite pub that they go to on Fridays. I think it's important to write that down so that others are aware. And I think it's just as important to pay attention to this when you first arrive as it is to pay attention to all the technical things. Again, you're the best place to find it when you're brand new. So future-proofing. This is the next steps after your first few months. You've already been in the job 6 months, you've found your feet. Now you've got all this documentation, and it's great. It's not perfect, and it needs to be solidified and made to be continually updated after you leave. So the most essential part of that is, I believe, accessibility. So that means everybody can read it, but also everybody, or most people, can edit it as well. So the internal documentation needs to be stored somewhere everyone will be able to access, and that's regardless of technical expertise, and even edit regardless of technical expertise. And that might require a bit of input by the employer, but it's really important. I believe a company neglecting accessibility for their internal documentation is basically like refusing to have a website, because the customers should just be expected to know your product. For example, the legal team might not have had much training with computers, but they need to be able to make a lot of edits to internal documentation. For instance, policy information. They need to be able to do that without a high level of technical expertise. So it also needs to be searchable. I think that's really important. Preventing knowledge loss is what documentation is all about. Big part of that is making sure people can access things that are written after you and everybody else involved has left the company or forgotten about it. If someone has a question, they should be able to ask a search engine for help. Search engine's not going to quit. And new changes to policy or process. So the longer you're in your role, the more changes that there are to that role. So you need to tell two kinds of people about any kind of policy or product change at your workplace. and that's your future replacements and your colleagues here and now. So there's a fantastic way to start documenting changes that are made at your company, and that's through emailing your employees. That's a great place to start, but it's a terrible place to end, because people are going to forget, and if there's an established habit of going to one place for knowledge, and that place is not updated when the emails come through, then it's gone. New hires won't have the opportunity to learn from this change, and the documentation goes stale. So at Fastmail, we use emails through topic box groups to let others know about any changes, including significant changes to documentation. And that's fantastic for making others aware, but it's not going to help update the permanent documentation. So one idea to encourage continuous documentation is to establish a company policy that if you email the update, you write the documentation. And another idea is to have a rotation of people to do it. For each week, it's a new person's responsibility to document all newly announced changes, and that'll help keep updates coming after you've left the company. And then there's the opposite risk, updating the documentation without telling others you have done so. People need to be made aware of changes to documentation so that it can become a collaborative process. So whenever I make a significant change to the internal documentation, I send an email to the relevant topic box group about it, and I ask for feedback from two groups: those who are newer or less familiar with whatever I'm writing about, and those who are more familiar than me. And those who are more familiar than me, obviously, they can read it over, and they can let me know if there's any factual errors or clear up anything from that perspective. But the people who have less experience than me in whatever I'm describing are just as important, because they can tell me if I've made it hard to follow or if I've assumed some sort of knowledge. And I think that's a fantastic way to get new people involved in the process and make them feel welcome and show that their contributions are valued. So quality internal documentation. It should be accessible. And that means there's a very low technical literacy bar to access the documentation. And it should be accessible by anyone who just uses a computer for web browsing and email. It should be editable, also by somebody with low technical skill, and I think also by junior staff members. They should be able to edit it as well. It should be searchable, because that will help find particularly obscure knowledge that nobody in the company has any current memory of. And it should be peer-reviewed. I've been talking about how the best person to write internal documentation is the new hire, because they can see gaps where somebody can't, somebody with more experience can't. But this can all be ruined if your work is not checked by somebody who's been there longer, because the only thing worse than dispensing no information is dispensing wrong information. And you also need to recruit new employees to review your work. There needs to be a really strong practice of ongoing peer review. So documentation can be a great way to help you learn on a steep learning curve and serve as a memory for you when there's no room in your brain to store all the new information. And it cuts down on training time significantly. We've seen that at Fastmail. It's been fantastic and helps cut down on fragmented knowledge. So yeah, thank you very much.
All right, well, luckily, we have about 5 minutes for any questions, if you're happy to take some.
Sorry?
Are you happy to take some questions? Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
Yes?
Just a comment to make with your future-proofing. Anyone who has documentation, make sure it's backed up and it can be restored.
Yeah, very true. Yeah.
Sorry, not a question, but one thing I did in a new job I started at, I created a map of where the meeting rooms are.
Sorry?
A map of the meeting rooms in our building.
Yeah, I've done that before. Yeah.
This is probably more of a cultural thing. I've just started as a junior SRE at a place, and they did the usual spiel of, if you find anything wrong on the wiki, go and update it. And it's like, okay, so I'm learning stuff here, and it's a hideously complex environment. And I've made updates, and they've immediately gone, no, back them out, that's wrong. So to the point where I stopped making updates to the wiki, and I spoke to other engineers there who'd been reasonably fresh, and they've gone through the same process. So I'm not sure how to culturally address that change.
It's quite hard, especially when you're starting. And I think that's, fortunately, I work at a place which is really fantastic in terms of that. I've been very lucky.
Are you hiring?
Sorry?
Are you hiring?
Yeah, actually. I think that's, there is a part of it where I feel that you might need some input from senior staff, either in terms of senior in terms of management, or people who've been there for 6 years who know everybody and are very well liked. I'm not sure how to fix that where you just by yourself.
It's a bit of a meta problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm an ex-fast mailer, and I'd be interested in talking to you offline about some of your experiences starting there. But one of the problems that I've had in the past at various companies has been like there's a whole lot of documentation that, in wiki pages that get out of date. And I've really struggled to work out how to say, okay, this is old documentation, how do we maintain it? How do we make time to review all of our documentation and find and clean out the stuff that's no longer relevant or updated? Do you have any information on that in a more generic sense? Yeah,
we've had that a little bit. That's why I mentioned that one of these new support team members is actually two of them. One of them is the one who told me about it. They're both searching the logs after only being here a month. It took us many months. We ended up setting aside, a couple of hours a day or a week or whatever to just do one thing, because, as I mentioned, I wasn't terribly concerned about wording or anything, so I just did it really quickly. And I think a big way to do it quickly is just separate out things into categories. That doesn't even require writing. We just copied and pasted a bunch of stuff and moved it into a different section, because it had been a little bit of, there's another bit of information, I'll just add that, I'll add that, I'll add that, and then it became a huge thing. Even half an hour a week, honestly, I found that made a huge difference in terms of that, and also getting lots and lots of people to do it, not just one person. I don't know anything about certain parts of what other people do, operations. They can sort that out, and I'll do I'll do my own area. Yeah.
Speaking to that direct problem there, sorry. What things we do at my company is that each of the pages has kind of a directly responsible person who it looks after that particular component, and their name is on the docs, and it also has a date of when they've last reviewed it. That's shown on the page that says, hey, this person is the reviewer, this is the last time they reviewed it. And after it gets past a configurable point, say 6 months or 12 months, there's a little warning that says this is outdated, and it automatically submits a bug against them to go and review it and check that it's all up to date. And all it is they just go and increment the date. It's like, yep, that's still good. And it kind of avoids that sort of documentation rot.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea. Yeah, we don't have that at the moment, but that's a really fantastic idea. Yeah.
Reading some maths books recently, the thing that helped me the most was the glossaries. So if you use a jargon glossary, it gives a common thing, and then you can use the jargon freely because there's a glossary that tells them the detail.
Yeah, I've had that a little bit. I came across certain email codes and flags of what happens to an email. Yeah, they make total sense when you know what they mean, but you got to first learn what they mean. So I have tried to pay attention to that a fair bit where I can.
All right, I think we're